Is MMA ruining martial arts? You know, I really think MMA adds some positive benefits to the public's perception of martial arts in a sense. You know, I think the good side of MMA is that the physical training is involved. I believe it's healthy for people in a certain age group to test their skills. That's always a part of the mixture. There's no question as to whether or not there's physical talent in MMA. The question is really, with any combative sport, is it martial art or is it a sport? Because when you have sport, you have winning and losing. When you have martial art, there are other values that are imparted. There's other reasons for training. With a combat sport, the goal is to win the match. Now, sometimes the argument becomes, well, this martial art's not effective, that martial art's not effective. You know, how do you measure it when the goal is different? So not everyone that studies martial art wants to compete with martial art. Sometimes people's reasons for coming to martial art are different. A combative sport has rules, and you learn to participate or play by those rules. Sometimes street combat, there are no rules. Martial arts that are highly ritualized have the same thing, you know, where they have a different way of practicing. So it's interesting that MMA brings something positive to the table, I think. The biggest differences is in judo. Joint holds and chokes are not taught to kids. They're not taught to kids at a certain age simply because there's a big responsibility. You know, you have growing children, and you talk about dislocations, you talk about breaking a bone, you know, the damage will be with them for the rest of their life, right? I mean, anyone that understands anything about the human body understands it's not a good idea to choke people into unconsciousness, you know, when their brain is still developing, you know? So those are things that just traditionally weren't done. Now, the variation of judo that's become Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they have different practice methods. And there's different philosophies. I mean, you have people teaching that are maybe blue belt level, purple belt level, which is quite different than, say, some of the traditional approaches where the instructor has endured a rigorous training to be an instructor, you know, and has a certain amount of experience. I think that's key. What I've seen with mixed martial arts that's been interesting is, you know, when something becomes popular, everybody and his brother starts to do it, right? The quality goes down. Doesn't matter what the subject is, doesn't matter what it is. You start to see quality go down. When you start seeing some of the better representatives of martial arts show up in things like the UFC, now it becomes more interesting, because now you have people that have acquired significant skill in these different disciplines. We're not talking about, you know, a few months of training, because all of us know that spending a few months doing boxing is different than being a boxer that's dedicated some years to the craft. And the skill set you're gonna see is different. You know, same thing with any other martial art or combat sport. And I think that's what's become interesting. There's a big difference between somebody that studied karate for a year and somebody that studied karate for 10 years and gets in the ring representing karate of some sort. You know, there's a big difference there. MMA has become its own discipline. And I think that can be said for many martial arts as well, where there's a lot of cross-pollination, if you will, a lot of techniques that are shared or borrowed or copied from martial art to martial art. Because when somebody looks over the fence and sees effective technique, they're inclined to say, hey, that's useful. You know what I mean? And it doesn't belong to any one category. I mean, some people think, for example, karate doesn't have any ground technique, or kung fu doesn't have this, or whatever. And it's not really the case. But the challenge is, have you seen kung fu at the highest level? Have you experienced it at the highest level? Or did you experience kung fu or karate at the most convenient level in your little town? Right. See, if that's all the exposure that you've ever seen, you haven't seen enough karate or kung fu to make any opinion about anything. So many of these commentators are going out speaking about what karate is, what kung fu is, and they not only have never studied these disciplines, they've never seen the highest level of them, or spoken with, or interacted with, or even seen some of those levels. So to make comments about what it is or what it's not there. The Olympic gold medal men's winner is from our style.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. He's from our style in Okinawa. Yeah.
Yeah. I know it's
very cool. Very
right.
cool.
It's all just different interpretations of the same technique, right? And I think it's kind of cool. Okay.
But just like all of us, right? When we grew up with karate, we had our favorite things coming up. Like when you're a green belt, you have your favorite form until you get to the next one, and then it becomes your new favorite or whatever, you know. And I think throughout your whole martial art career, you're always going to have these preferences, these ways of thinking based on who you are right now and the experiences you've had. But then you have new experiences, and that affects what you think and affects what you believe, because I mean, that's how we learn, right? That's how we grow. Well, I think the definition of spirit is really important, because there are some people that would say spirit as in fighting spirit. Well, that could also be said to be attitude. Just like when you say, when people say a boxer has heart, what does that really mean? That means they have fortitude. That means they have that indomitable spirit. That means they're not going to back up. They're not going to back off. They're going to step up to a challenge. That's a mental discipline. When you say spiritual to a person that has a spiritual inclination or an understanding of other practices, other methods, meditative practices, and the goals of training on a broader scope, it means something different. Now, does the MMA touch into that? I think the answer is no. I think everybody that practices MMA understands that. Anybody that has any inclination, they know. But as far as the benefits of MMA, I think the personal challenge, I think developing solid skills that are useful in fighting of various types, and just like with other combative sports, whether it's judo, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, boxing, these are great opportunities for you to test yourself and learn something about yourself, because ultimately all the martial arts that are practiced on a long term are all about self-knowledge. And I think MMA will definitely promote a level of self-knowledge. Now, is it the do-all and end-all? For me, no. There's more to martial art than that. That's a much broader interpretation. I think for me, martial art has to be able to address more than one question for more than one person. If I'm looking at empowering someone, that doesn't necessarily mean they need to be a sport practitioner. That has to do with how they feel about themselves. If I work with developmentally disabled, they may never get in an octagon. They may never get in a cage. Does that mean they can't be a martial artist? Does that mean there's no value to their practice? What about the 80-year-old who's losing balance and worried about breaking a hip and dying? Does that mean they can't benefit from martial art because they're not interested in the sparring component, or it's not appropriate for them? A doctor or an executive that doesn't want to get their hands broken or their arms broken in practice, does that mean they can't effectively practice martial arts? Certainly not. So, Martial art is many things to many people. It's not just about competing. But when you're in a certain age group, certain category, it's healthy to get out there, test your skills with others that have that interest. And it's a natural progression, but only for some. Well, I think that's going to depend on the individual, because there are people that practice traditional disciplines, traditional martial art, that they don't have a very realistic interpretation of the martial art. And that's where the combat athletes kind of lose interest with the traditional martial artists, because there's no common ground. If a traditional martial artist has pushed himself and has a certain level of self-knowledge, now they're going to come up with some similar conclusions to the MMA person, because they're both raising the bar. And that's the common ground, I think. The problem comes when you're not raising the bar, but you're doing a lot of talking. Nobody wants to hear that. See, if we're talking somebody that understands the value of conditioning, somebody understands what happens to the body when contact is introduced, things like that, there's a common ground, and that's how we develop. We establish a common ground, now we can have a conversation, right? Now we can share ideas, okay? But when we focus on just what's different about what we're doing and what's not the same, it's the division. So I think there's a lot of common ground that can be shared, but there are some big differences that have to be noted, and they need to be respected for what they are. Because MMA is a combat sport, the actual sparring aspect is the sharpening of the sword. And I mean, they spend time on technique, but they spend a lot of time on being in the ring and actually doing. Whereas with traditional martial art, there are other categories of practice that happen. And particularly in this country, there's different phenomena that's happened with martial art too. There's some schools that say they're teaching martial art. They're not really teaching that martial art. What that means is, if you say you're a karate person, you're teaching karate. Your karate should be no different than the karate being practiced in Japan, being practiced in France, or anything. It shouldn't be less effective. You shouldn't have taken out components, things like that. There should be a common ground where your karate can work in any environment, and people will recognize it as what it is. That includes sparring. That has to include technique. When I meet up with MMA people from different backgrounds and things like that, there's no weirdness, there's no lack of respect, because they understand, even if they don't know me, they understand, oh, he gets it. Oh, he understands, because I know how to fight. And it comes from having experience in the ring. You can't fake that. You can't fake having self-knowledge like we talked about before. Just can't. Personally, I think martial art is a vehicle for self-knowledge. I think it's a vehicle for empowerment. I think it can help people to ultimately achieve a better balance overall, because it's one of the few pursuits that I've found that is not merely physical. There's the physical side that's obvious. There's the introduction of mental disciplines. And then there's the introduction of the building of spirit. Now, people that are familiar with different Asian concepts regarding meditative practices and spiritual practices understand that controlling the mind, not mind control like in the West where I'm doing like this freaky stuff to control other people. It's about being able to control my mind when I have that negative self-talk that everybody has. When I have those voices that tell me I want more sweets than I need to have, or I need to stop doing these self-destructive things. It's developing an understanding of how to get the most out of myself. I know people that are coached or are coaches themselves that draw heavily from martial art concepts in order to get the best out of their performance. And I think there's no question about whether martial art can serve that purpose and serve it in the long term. And I found that as a child, and I've never left it. So MMA is not ruining martial arts. What ruins martial arts is people not understanding what they're getting involved in. If you go into MMA, you're going into a combat sport that has all the values of combat sports. When you go into a traditional or modern martial art, that is a different animal than a competitive sport. As long as you understand that, you're good. They both can coexist.